Greetings, rail fans. Welcome back to Coda Productions. This video is quite different from normal. Within this video, we will be explaining the chemical compositions of things that trains carry, as well as how energy affects sounds and movements that trains make. First off, we're going to start simple, with a railroad crossing. Some who don't know may be wondering how trains can cause railroad crossings to go off. Now here I'm going to show you how. Now the diagram I'm about to show you is of a simple circuit, but pretty much can explain how railroad crossings work in their entirety. The diagram to your left shows an open circuit. See the two red dots? Think of those as the two rails on a railroad track. The battery, which is stored inside of the railroad crossing itself, and the lamp is the actual railroad crossing's lights and gates. Now in the diagram to your right, it shows the switch on. Now when a train enters the circuit of the railroad crossing, so an electrical current can flow through the train's axles and through the other side to complete the circuit and start the railroad crossing. When this action is performed, you are completing the circuit, which is called a closed circuit. All railroad crossings have a set zone, so when the train enters a certain point, the railroad crossing goes off. These are all different in different places depending on the speed limit of trains in certain areas. And once the train enters this circuit, giving enough time for the gates to come all the way down, within about 30 more seconds, you get the train. The exact same kind of setup is on the other side of the railroad crossing, to which when the train clears this part of the circuit opens once again and deactivates the lights and gates. Now, how exactly does a diesel locomotive work? Large diesel locomotives underneath the shell of the long hood convert diesel fuel with the chemical composition of C12H20 into electricity, which powers the traction motors, which causes the train to move. So basically, the diesel engine is converting the diesel fuel into potential energy, which will be talked about in a second, and the remaining waste is blown out through the exhaust stack on the top of the locomotive as vapor and smoke. Now here's an example of a train working very hard to get its load over the road. Here is CSX train Q604 coming out of Winston Yard at Lakeland, Florida, coming up a 2.3% grade hill, and because of this, they're just starting out of a yard, so they have to get their train going quick. And since they're coming up a hill with about 10,000 feet of mixed freight for Waycross, Georgia, these two locomotives have to work their hardest to convert as much fuel as possible to get the train moving quickly. Now let's get into how energy directly affects trains and how they work on terms of movements. There are two major energy types we're going to be talking about here, potential and kinetic. Potential energy is stored energy, and kinetic energy is the energy of motion. Now how do these two affect certain operations, such as applying the brakes? Now, first you have to understand how train brakes work. Through air hoses that connect each car in the train, a function in the locomotive cab, in fact many of them, can control the air pressure, which controls mostly the brakes, but other functions in each car of the train that can contribute to how they work. Now when the engineer in the locomotive applies the brakes, small apparatuses called brake shoes slowly grind against the axle to slow each car down. Now, since the train is already moving, there is plenty of kinetic energy that needs to go somewhere. Since energy cannot be created or destroyed, when the train stops, this kinetic energy has to go somewhere. It cannot be destroyed. So as the brake shoe grinds against each axle on the train, the energy is released as heat and sound. Have you ever heard a screeching sound when an engineer applies the brakes? That's partially the kinetic energy being released as the train comes to a stop. Now that you know the basics of energy, we'll get into certain railroad practices that contribute to these types of energy. In an act of efficiency, railroads are using a practice used all across the country, which is using distributed power units, or DPUs. These distributed power units are locomotive or locomotives distributed throughout the front, middle, or end of the train. These distributed power units are extra locomotives besides the one at the front, which are distributed between the middle and or end of a train. Mostly these DPUs are used when extra power is needed, such as mountainous territory or things like that, but sometimes they are simply used not because extra power is needed, but because it is easier to handle a train. Here is a quick example of a DPU locomotive being used on a CSX northbound intermodal QO26 coming through Folkston, Georgia. As usual, we have the two or one locomotive at the front, and midway in the train, we have the distributed power locomotive. Believe me, 2 or 3 locomotives is way more than enough to pull a train from the front, but just because it is easier to handle, they put one in the middle as well. Now, let's focus on how some of the sounds that trains make as they roll along their lines are made. Of course, these all have to do with energy, and a lot of it. Here's your example. Here is CSX train Q441 coming south through Plant City, Florida. Do you hear that sound? It's a sound unique to this one railroad apparatus called a diamond interlocking. A diamond interlocking is an at-grade crossing of 2 rail lines. In this case, the Atlantic Coastline Railroad from Tampa and the old Seaboard Coastline Main from Tampa. Now, for each of these 2 lines to pass over each other, there has to be a break in both of the rails so the wheel flanges can pass through on either side. Now, because of this, there is a slight gap or hole in the rail as the axles pass over it. And what you're hearing is those axles dropping in and out of those little gaps in small fractions of a second. So basically, right as the axles come over these gaps, they have potential energy. And when the axles fall into the gaps, the potential energy is released as sound and vibrations. Now, because of these constant vibrations and them being caused by hundreds of thousands of pounds of freight bouncing in and out of them every day, they shake all of the apparatuses connected to them, such as the bolts holding them in place, which is why interlockings like this require constant maintenance, at the very least a weekly inspection. So here's a little bit of a recap on what we've learned so far. Down around the corner we can't see, there is a rock train that is ready to shove its consist up to its industry about a mile away. Now there are no DPUs or anything on this train, so we can really see energy being enforced on this move. Since this line is not heavily used, the circuit for the railroad crossing is not set very far back, so the train must get very close before completing the circuit. Yes, there are also certain laws of motion. The first one saying and stating, objects in motion will stay in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. Now, since this train is shoving backwards, the engineer cannot see what is going on, and the conductor must watch from the very end and tell the engineer what is going on via radio. So every time they come up on a crossing which does not have bells, lights, or gates, they have to stop and drop flares at them. So as the train stops, because there is only power on one end, the cars continue to move until they are stopped by one another. Once the flares are dropped, the train begins to shove back again. And when this process begins, there is potential energy in the locomotive that needs to be converted into kinetic energy as the train begins to move. This energy is converted via sound as each car hits another as they begin to move again. That's it for the lesson on energy. Now it's time to get into some of the more nerdy stuff. What trains are carrying? This will have to do with the chemical compositions and certain other details about what trains every day are carrying across the USA. The first one I'll talk about is a major commodity in Florida, diammonium phosphate. Diammonium phosphate is mined in CSX's Bone Valley region, including of Bartow, Mulberry, Bradley, and other places south and east and west of there that include phosphate open pit mining. These are all loaded onto unit trains and sent north mostly to Illinois. Here is CSX train K814, loaded diammonium phosphate coming north through Folkston, Georgia, making his way north toward Bensonville, Illinois. Diammonium phosphate has the chemical composition of NH4, 2, and HPO4. Diammonium phosphate is commonly used in fertilizers, but can be found in many things used every day in our everyday lives. Just as important as the loaded ones are the empty phosphate trains. Here is a southbound empty diammonium phosphate train heading back to the Bone Valley for more diammonium phosphate to go back north with. This train is running under the ID of K815 from Bensonville back to Mulberry. Two special treats tonight. Along with the two foreign locomotives leading, there happened to be another train coming the other direction, which passed the other train by at almost the exact same time. Here's another smaller example of diammonium phosphate trains running as locals. These phosphate locals run back and forth between Rockport Yard at Tampa and Mulberry and the Bone Valley region, delivering phosphate back and forth to the ship terminals to be shipped out by sea. This one running under the ID of K311, switched to K from O from its one commodity status. Here's another one commodity train carrying a fairly serious product for this part of Florida, C2H5OH, or ethanol in simple terms, since the new mandate requires that gasoline contain 10% ethanol when sold at the pump. This is where they get their ethanol from. Here is Csx Ethanol Train K423, on his way from Bensonville, Illinois to Tampa, Florida's Hookers Point ethanol terminal, where the ethanol is unloaded and then mixed with gasoline at the Tampa terminals. These ethanol trains can get a fairly decent length, commonly 5,000 feet or more of it. Here is a train that has since been abolished by CSX as the industry that it served closed about a year ago. However, the train that you are seeing right now consists of two main commodities, diammonium phosphate and ammonia. This is CSX train 0825. The hoppers in the very front would be carrying diammonium phosphate. They're currently empty, but will be loaded on their way back to Tampa for loading aboard ships. And the ammonia tanks are loaded, headed out to the industry to be unloaded over there. So currently, this train consists of empty NH4, 2, and HPO4, along with loaded NH3, or diammonium phosphate and ammonia. Now, here's a train that I catch and post all the time, the CSX Tropicana juice train. This train runs from Bradenton to Tampa, from Tampa to Jacksonville, then Jacksonville to California, Ohio, and New Jersey with ice-cold orange juice. Orange juice is not exactly a compound, it is more of a mixture, including of C12H22O11 sugar and C6H8O7 citric acid. For this very last example, we are set up out on the U.S. Sugar Railroad in Clewiston, Florida. The United States Sugar Corporation owns hundreds of thousands of acres where they grow sugar cane and have their harvest season from early October to late March. And when the cane is harvested, they bring it in by rail. And once they get to the sugar refinery, it is refined into C12H22O11, or sugar in simple terms. To close out this video, here's a quick drone shot of me pacing the sugar train as it heads off into the fields.